back and it's live coming to you from number 1 Union Avenue from the Heart and Soul Studio Broadcasting Services, which is the heartbeat of the nation where we communicate for change. Today I am joined in the studio by a phenomenal commercial law expert, Miss Beatrice Moyo. Please just introduce yourself to listeners.
Good afternoon, listeners. My name is Beatrice Moyo, practicing legal practitioner with an interest in commercial law and corporate law.
Glad to have you on the show. Welcome, Miss Moyo. And when Miss Moyo and I were just discussing the show before we jumped into the studio, I was really quizzical as to how she made it through law school in South Africa. So, Miss Moyo, please just clarify that for myself and so many other law students out there who may just have an interest into understanding, the divide when you go to a law school in a foreign country and then you come back home like you did and, become a successful commercial law expert. So tell us about that.
Thank you so much. So when I applied to law school, I did not know that if you study in South Africa, you have to return to Zimbabwe and do what is called conversions exams.
Okay.
Which essentially means your South African degree needs to be converted to the Zimbabwean equivalent so that you can practice and register as a lawyer in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
But nonetheless, I studied in South Africa, in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal.
Okay.
Did
and how was the student experience in KwaZulu-Natal?
It's absolutely epic. I mean, Durban is the warmest place to be.
Okay.
I'm Ndebele by culture, so I didn't have a language barrier, but it's a great place to be regardless.
All right.
The people are very warm. It's a beautiful location.
Yes.
The law school was new, so everything was very frontier and modern. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So it was a 4-year degree.
Okay.
And then I came back to Zimbabwe and did the conversions process.
Okay.
So I sat for the 6 exams, and here I am today, registered and practicing.
Okay. And how long have you been practicing for?
So I've been practicing for a total of 5 years.
Okay.
Yes. But last year I was away doing my master's in Cape Town.
Okay. So that was like an academic sabbatical.
Yes, an academic sabbatical.
Okay. No, that's nice. One question I also came across when we were discussing this topic with other people on social media is, why do we have commercial law? Why the need to have a specialized branch of the law that deals with businesses? So what would be your take on that as an expert?
That's a very important question.
Yeah.
Commercial law is necessary because corporates form the bulk of activity, financial activity. They contribute to the fiscus.
Okay.
So it's important to regulate how they interact with each other, with individuals, employees, with different branches of government.
Okay.
And that is why it's important to have commercial law.
Okay. Yeah, I like what you used there to, devolve into all the other branches in government and also in the private sector, because here at Legal Matters, we're passionate about legal awareness. We are passionate about making sure that people understand how exactly the law applies, because we feel like the law is not being used in Zimbabwe to its fullest extent, because people just don't know how to use it. So like you said, the law in commerce is there to regulate it and make sure that it, just goes smoothly. So yeah, I'm glad to have you on the show, Miss Moyo. Today we're going to be talking about business and human rights, which is something that, raises eyebrows whenever it's said along the same lines, because most people don't even understand where the phenomenon is coming from. But then as lawyers, you will know that there is a whole international legislation that is there which provides, for the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. So just before we, get into the business of the day, what exactly is this discourse about business and human rights, and where exactly is it coming from?
Thank you. That's a very interesting topic. Business and human rights, it's not a topic that is usually explored. And I think it's because of the lack of awareness that businesses actually do impact on human rights.
Right.
The general perception is that human rights should be protected by the government and the state.
Okay, let me just stop you over there, Ms. Moyo.
Yes.
I just remembered about something that I learned when I was in high school, when I was doing business studies, something called corporate social responsibility. And, when I learned about this principle, even though it was still alien to business and human rights to my mind, it just felt like the same thing. So what exactly now is the difference between companies and businesses having corporate social responsibilities and this whole advent of business and human rights?
I think the advent of business and human rights goes deeper.
Okay.
It is about businesses going beyond just corporate social
Yes,
responsibility.
yes.
And corporate social responsibility usually involves some sort of monetary project in a
Okay.
community.
Yes.
This business and human rights involves the company, the
Okay.
board of directors, I would
Okay.
say, in being actively involved in seeking to see how their business operations affect human rights.
Yes.
So human rights like forced labor, employees getting paid equally,
Okay.
gender equality on boards and in the company,
Yes.
safety, because all these are human rights that individuals and employees
and-
have.
Yes, and I feel like it's really important to stress that human rights are something just, are given to someone by virtue of them being human. So if we now have businesses living up to policies that uphold human rights, then in essence, that's a good thing for everyone because their dignity, is not violated in any way. And I'm also just glad to be talking about human rights on this note because the supreme law of Zimbabwe, the constitution, explicitly has a justiciable bill of rights, which means if you go to chapter 4 and you look at those rights, they can be enforced. Now, basically, what the whole advent of business and human rights, if I got that correct, is now enforcing these human rights on businesses to make sure that they uphold each and every one of them.
That's very true. In fact, one of my areas of expertise is corporate governance.
Okay.
And corporate governance has shifted
Yes.
in the recent past
Yes.
to stop companies from focusing solely on making profit,
Okay.
regardless of the consequences that it has on the people, on the
Yes.
community that it is
Yes.
operating in,
Yes.
and moving that to businesses focusing on how their operations affect stakeholders,
Okay.
being
Yes.
employees, being the
Yes.
community in which you operate,
Yes.
being creditors. So
Yes.
this advent of business and human rights is very important, especially in light of the spotlight that is on corporate governance, not only in Zimbabwe, but
Yes.
worldwide.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it, listeners. We have Miss Beatrice Moyo, and I'm sure everyone can tell you're now an expert on these matters, and they're dying to hear what else we have to talk about business and human rights. So today on Legal Matters, we're just going to have two other segments where we're going to try and get legal-wise and also just try and basically explain how directors and people who make decisions in a company are ultimately responsible for business and human rights. And if I'm not mistaken, Miss Moyo recently authored a book. What's the name of the book?
Thank you. So we authored a book called The Director's Handbook in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
Your listeners or your readers would be interested to know that there's a New Companies Act in Zimbabwe.
Yes.
And there was not much text written about the implications of the Companies Act in Zimbabwe. So this handbook addresses the director's duties, corporate governance requirements and responsibilities that companies should be aware of. It also has a list of precedents that assist directors and companies ensure that they're legally and regulatory compliant.
Okay.
So it's a quick reference guide
Yes.
that's very useful for directors, and that is readily available in Harare for only $20. It was readily available in Harare, and it's a useful tool. We've been selling it, I think, since June 2021, and we've received so much feedback from directors on how useful and necessary it is for directors either in startups or even well-renowned companies to just refresh on what the law requires of a director sitting on a board. So I co-authored this book with my colleagues Chiroma Fongoya and Kelvin Sabao, and we've also got a legal blog which answers the day-to-day questions that we've received following the publishing of the handbook.
And how can people access the blog? Because you know what, I always say on Legal Matters that it's very mistaken or it's very wrong to be ignorant about the law in 2021, a digital age where information is all over. So how exactly can people access the blog, Lex Amicus blog, is it?
Yes.
And
so
what does Lex Amicus mean?
So Lex Amicus means your legal friend. The idea being that we want to simplify the law, make it readily available and accessible to individuals. We focus on corporate law, international law, corporate governance, and such related matters. The blog is, you type it into Google, you'll come across it. We've got a LinkedIn page, Facebook page, Lex Amicus. You can find us online easily. We've also got a Twitter account. We're interested, we engage with our readers, and we answer questions that readers have.
And thank you as well for bringing out that issue of engagement, because like I said, Heart and Soul is a young studio that is, the heartbeat of the nation. And on the whole C4C campaign, Communicating for Change, we are also trying to communicate about change. So, like you said, Zimbabwe did not have progressive legislation in terms of these companies,
Yes.
but now it does.
Yes.
So, that's a thumbs up to the government for implementing new laws that are now relevant with the times. So, yeah, we'll get into that as well. And lastly, on the last segment, which is my personal favorite, the law in action segment, we'll just basically get to talking about some examples where business and human rights collide, or instances where businesses seem to pave way to make sure that human rights are upheld, with a particular attention on the issue of preservation of the environment, considering that organizations such as the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association are spearheading initiatives to just spread the awareness and also the mechanics of how business and human rights also operate on the level of environmental protection, of sustainable development. So, listeners, we'll just take a short break. Stay tuned on legal matters, and you'll be legal wise by the time the show is over. So, don't go anywhere. Stay glued to your seats. We'll be right back on legal matters. Good afternoon. We are back on Legal Matters. I am joined in the studio today by Miss Beatrice Moyo, who is a commercial law expert, and we are about to move on to the first segment that we have prepared with regards to the issue of business and human rights. But before we get into that, I would just like to mention that this whole advent of business and human rights is being tied to the issue of the dignity of humanity. So I was actually interested when Miss Moyo was saying we can even extend this whole issue of business and human rights to the enforcement of things like gender equality.
Yes.
So how exactly does that fall into the paradigm of business and human rights, Miss Moyo?
So, as you mentioned earlier, that our human rights are enshrined in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, and the Constitution guarantees certain rights to all individuals in the nation,
Yes.
specifically gender equality and gender diversity.
Yes.
This would apply to businesses and human rights in the sense that there's an obligation on companies to ensure that their boards of directors reflect gender diversity.
Yes.
Not the board should not only be male.
Okay, sorry. And by gender diversity, you mean that if there are 5 employees in an office,
Yes.
3 of them should be women?
Yes, and I think for affirmative action, I know many of our listeners may dispute that and say, why should the women be more than the men? But I think in light of the history that we're coming from, where these spaces...
I could not agree with you more.
These spaces were predominantly occupied by men. I think
Yes.
it's time that the women be given an opportunity to
Yes.
occupy these positions
Yes.
and to participate in the process, and
Yes.
not on the basis that they're female only, but because we are qualified and we have a voice to be heard and we have something to contribute.
Yes, and I feel like that's exactly where the starting point is. It's not that if there are 3 women in an office that has 5 people, there will not be production. There will be production, and just evidence from the fact that you're on Legal Matters right now as a commercial law expert should actually inspire other women out there as well to take on the initiative and get things done as well.
So true. And the human rights aspect of it is that obviously the Constitution guarantees rights of freedom from discrimination.
Yes.
There's also women rights enshrined in there.
Yes.
So it's not only in the representation in the boards, but also
Yes.
I think regards remuneration. I mean, there's worldwide studies where women tend to be paid less than men.
Yes.
That's a violation of business and human rights.
Yes,
and
yes,
and
yes.
I think it needs to be addressed not only in Zimbabwe but world over.
Yes, and you know what? I'm really grateful for that example that you gave over there, because it really clarifies how exactly businesses can infringe on human rights.
Exactly.
So, like you said, if a business is paying a teacher, okay, maybe a school is paying a teacher $100, and then that teacher is a male teacher, and then they pay a female teacher less than that, they are now infringing on the human rights on the issue of equality.
Exactly,
Yes,
exactly,
yes.
exactly.
So it's really important that that example is clear, because it really evidences why the law is in action, because
Yes,
the law works and people really need to see that the law works.
yes,
Yes.
yes, yes.
So we were running a poll just trying to find out what people think about business and human rights. So I'm just going to read out one response that came from a law student from the University of Zimbabwe, who's doing a dissertation on business and human rights, apparently. Yeah, so I just thought that this might interest you and also our other listeners out there. So Henry Mpondi says, businesses are currently being evaluated by important stakeholders on the basis of their overall impact on the economy, the environment, and society, including human rights. As scrutiny from stakeholders rises, disputes relating to human rights impacts on businesses and activities are likely to arise. A number of jurisdictions have enacted legislation to deal with strengthening transparency on social and local governance of business activities. So I really thought about that, and I thought about initiatives that Zimbabwe has done as well on the issue of promoting business and human rights. Can you probably give us maybe one in respect to, like labor organizations that are there to actually protect the labor rights of employees? So in essence, this also cascades to that issue of business and human rights. So what do you think about Mr. Mpondi's, assertion with regards to this issue?
It's a very interesting session, and I think the government in Zimbabwe has taken progressive steps in
Yes.
trying to address and align with international norms. I mean, in the new Companies Act I was telling you about, there's now an obligation on directors to take into account the social impact that the
Okay.
decisions of the company has
Yes.
on the environment and on the
Okay.
community that it operates in.
Okay.
I mean, we've got a long way to go in Zimbabwe,
Yes.
specifically because in terms of the Companies Act, corporate governance,
Yes.
which would mandate directors
Yes.
to ensure that their decisions are in line
Yes.
with human rights, only applies to public companies and not private companies. So
Okay.
that's a
Okay.
big gap.
So that's a big gap as well. I hope organizations like like the Legal Resources Foundation and the Human Rights Forums are listening, because these are gaps they need to be enacting through public polls, through public legislation, to make sure that the government, the legislation which the people who draft these laws understand those gaps and fill them before more harm is done.
That's true. And an example can be had with our neighbor, South Africa. South Africa has made it so wide that not only public companies, but
Yes.
private companies
Okay.
must ensure that their decisions
Okay.
in how they impact the community
Yes.
aligns and is not violating human rights.
Okay.
They
Okay.
also mandate the directors to consider the impact that every decision that the company takes has
All right.
on employees, all stakeholders, in fact.
Okay, I just thought about something. The level of unemployment in Zimbabwe, but then also the level of like lifestyle standards in Zimbabwe as well. There's a discrepancy, because it seems like most people are now operating informal businesses, and for me, informal businesses and the whole discourse of business and human rights becomes a problem, because how exactly now can these informal companies make sure they are there to the business and human rights standards, because they may not even be registered?
That's so true. And I
Yes.
think that's where the issue of the UN guiding principles becomes very important.
Yes.
We need advocacy groups to come forth and highlight the importance of businesses complying with human rights.
Yes.
And why this is important is because, in terms of the UN guiding principles, not only the company has an obligation not to violate human rights,
Okay.
but the state has an obligation to ensure that there's legislation in place
Yes.
to either penalize
Yes.
or to regulate
Okay.
that companies in comply with human rights. And I
Yes,
think this
yes.
there's a space, there's a gap, in fact,
Yes.
for people to come to the fore. Organizations to how do we say, like to
Yes, to
encourage
enforce.
the
Yes,
government to come up with legislation that not only
Yes.
regulates the public sector
Yes.
or the formal sector, but also the informal sector. This can be done through having sort of licenses
Yes, yes.
or
And
some sort of penalties.
yeah, and I'm sure just from like the activities government has been undertaking right now we'll be seeing that legislation to that extent coming soon, because like the whole advent is new from corporate social responsibility. I feel like the government in terms of policy is trying to get to an extent where people firstly recognize it, and then thereafter they can punish people after they know what's going on and after they find them in the wrong for violating these laws. But then also the whole issue of informal businesses, it keeps me worried because they do not have the access or the reach. Because I'm sure right now maybe an informal business owner may be listening, but then there is no structure whereby we can enforce business and human rights on informalized businesses, which is why as well the government has been taking on the initiative to make registering companies easy.
Yes.
So yeah, I would just like to encourage people who are listening right now to legal matters to actually think about that if they're running informal businesses, because the process is so simple and there are so many advantages that are to be had from having a formalized business. And in terms of corporate governance as well, I'm sure there are advantages, isn't it?
Yes, that is very correct. In fact, for small to medium enterprises, there's many associations that these business owners can approach for assistance. I mean, law firms, such as the one that I am in now, can assist formalize the operations of informal sector and just regularize their processes.
All right. No, that's amazing. And like I was saying, the information is all over the internet. People just need to learn how exactly they can access it and harness it and then use it to their own advantage. So there you have it, listeners. We're talking about business and human rights. And like Ms. Moyo is saying, the whole advent of business and human rights is not a competition between business and human rights. But then from what I'm gathering is they are supposed to coexist in a manner where business flourishes and human rights flourishes. But then now, is it always the same thing for those profit-oriented businesses? Because if they're trying to sell so much and have sweatshops running, then, it's definitely a major concern that should be considered.
That's true. In fact, there's been studies that have been held internationally that show the link of profit loss and the violation of human rights. Why do I say this? Where a company is involved in violation of human rights, so perhaps there's in the community that they operate, they don't adhere to the human rights, perhaps they're polluting the water, they're affecting the community. Senior management will have to be deployed when disputes arise to go and try and resolve these disputes, and that's loss of time and that's loss of productive time for the company. Settlement, trying to settle disputes that arise from the violation of human rights, that costs the bottom line of the company. So it's quite important for companies to not only think that investing in human rights means expending money, but realizing that it's solving a problem in the long run, and that will save income.
Yes, and you know what? Every business that gives back to society ultimately grows, because the people come back and feed on that business because of the benefit that it also has on the people.
Precisely. And you see, that's the reputation of companies is tied very closely to how the company interacts with the humans that it deals with, be it employees or the community or customers. So it's quite important for businesses to take this as an important topic and deploy. I mean, many companies have created committees that assess how the business is affecting the human rights of individuals that it interacts with, and how it can then avoid any risks that may arise from violation.
Okay, and the other thing as well that I was thinking about was the Nike scandal that happened, the labor scandal, just going on to that issue as well. So I'm trying to consider how exactly us as people who are not directly in business and human rights can also protect business and human rights. I mean, the simple decision not to buy a product because someone made it in unfair conditions will as well be an enforcement mechanism for business and human rights. What would be your take on that?
I think that's a very interesting take, and I believe going back to the UN guiding principles, which mandate that there be appropriate remedies available to individuals who feel that their human rights have been violated. So it's up to the individual who feels that either this company is not adhering to human rights or has violated their own human rights to either complain directly to the company, engage the leadership of that company. If that fails, you approach human rights organizations like you were talking about being Zela, or you go to court and you try to have this issue resolved. And I think it's quite important that individuals be active in identifying behavior of companies that violates human rights and then following it through by complaining and making enough noise about it such that this behavior does not get perpetuated. Because I think in Zimbabwe, there's that perception that companies just don't care.
Yes,
But
yes.
that has to change. In fact, there's a new Consumer Protection Act.
Yes, yes.
So that's another recourse that customers have to
Yes, and
complain.
yeah, I really like the example that you used over there, because when we talk about the United Nations guiding principles, people who are listening to legal matters right now are probably thinking, oh, I can only do that in America. But then you have said it clearly. We have organizations like the Zimbabwe Human Rights Lawyers Association, like the Human Rights NGO Forum. All these organizations are there to provide, access. So it's access to the legal support systems that people need, and then also access to the businesses that people deal with. So I really feel like it's an initiative that people have to take up, because it's not superficial. The law is in action, and the law really really is, useful in Zimbabwe, and that's how people can actually go about it and also make sure that they contribute to the whole advent of business and human rights.
That's
Because
very true.
yeah, like you were saying, most of these corporates in Zimbabwe, just because they own the capital, they have the money, it feels like they are unstoppable when they violate labor laws, when they violate human rights. But then the advent of business and human rights is saying, no, you're liable. There are punishments that can come your way if you violate such rights in terms of the law.
That's very true,
Yeah,
and which is why I think we need in Zimbabwe to have more focus on those UN guiding principles, because they
yeah,
shift the responsibility to not only be on any single entity, but to be on the government, and then on the company itself, and then on us as individuals who have to enforce the rights that we have. So that's a very interesting point, and I totally
yes,
agree.
yes, yes. And I feel like, it's for each and every Zimbabwean to make, the legal system in Zimbabwe better by believing that the law actually works and the law actually has results. And the best way for people to be able to do that is to take up the initiative and, do the process in terms of the law as it is, and not try and cut shortcuts, because, the whole issue of business and human rights has also been affected by other issues like, corruption. Yeah, so what's exactly the take on that now? Now that directors are the people who will be running the company, are they completely insulated from corruption? Because I feel like that can be a major issue when it comes to enforcing business and human rights.
That's very interesting, which is why I'm with such a I'm an advocate of the new Companies Act and
Mm-hmm.
commercial law, because it creates stringent duties for directors. So
Okay.
directors can no longer hide behind these vague duties that they had in the past.
Yes.
The directors' duties are now very clear. We discussed that in depth in the director's handbook,
Okay.
and we outlined the consequences for directors where they don't follow their duties. So now, in terms of the new Companies Act, there's both criminal sanction and
Okay.
civil sanction. So a
Okay.
director may be sued.
Yes.
And I think that is pushing directors to become more accountable to not only the company but to every stakeholder involved.
Yes.
And it's a plus for corporate law, in fact.
It is, and also just considering the whole issue that most businesses have now gone digital, either be it social commerce, either be it, online trading, whatever the case may be. Most businesses have gone digital. So I was trying to understand how exactly technology can also have an infringement on human rights, because, just looking at the Zimbabwean constitution, there's a right to privacy. But then now, if businesses, are using that information that they should not be having with regards to the consumers' preferences, with regards to their, preferable tastes, then we have an issue. Because there's a story I heard about here that occurred on, this whole digital wave and privacy thing, where a lady was actually told by her Google suggestion that she was pregnant before she even knew it. Yeah, so it's also another issue as well, because businesses have been buying privatized information or private information about consumers so as to be able to give them tailor-made products. So what exactly is your take on that? Businesses are now using technology to infringe on human rights, but then now it's like they're using a proxy, and it's no longer the business, but then it's now something that's technological.
That's very true. I think, in fact, Zimbabwe is lagging behind just a little bit in that
Okay.
regard. Unlike our neighbor South Africa, which has an Electronic Transactions Act,
Okay.
which specifically protects privacy rights and
Yes.
details what businesses ought to do
Yes.
regards personal information that is obtained or direct marketing, and prevents that violation in that
Yes.
regard with serious penalties, both criminal and civil.
Yes.
Zimbabwe doesn't have a comparable act.
Yes.
So really the obligation is on businesses to act in an appropriate manner
Yes.
using international standards, which are not really binding. And
Yes. Yes.
you see,
Yes.
so there's a bit of a lacuna there, but
Yes.
we implore businesses and we trust that they don't violate our rights. But as you know,
Yeah. You know what? You're completely right. And in as much as there was that whole lacuna, I have to give Parliament a props up because I heard about the cyber security and data protection bill.
yes,
That is sailed through Parliament. So once it's an act and it's in force, I'm sure most of the businesses
Yes.
can be prevented from using these issues of data privacy and cyber security to actually infringe on consumers' human rights.
That's very true.
Yes, and I also feel like for the people who are doing the law that is cyber related, there's a bit of need to lobby the government in terms of protecting consumers technologically within the new Consumer Protections Act. What would be your take on that?
I think you've raised a very interesting point. However, like I said, the new Consumer Protection Act is quite comprehensive. It's
Yes.
actually very progressive. There's a whole consumer commission that is set up to address any violations that consumer feels that they have. So I think there's a call to the public and also perhaps to us legal writers to just inform and raise awareness on the
Okay.
recourse that's available for consumers. Of course, like I've said, there's a bit of a lacuna there regards technological
Yes.
violation, but with the cyber bill that's coming out, I've read it, it's
Yes.
brilliant.
Yes.
And there's going to be a number of protections that are granted to individuals. Once that is an act, it will be safe and secure for consumers both in the physical world and the
Yes.
technological world
Yes. But
regards violations.
Yes, definitely. And I can see that lawyers of your caliber are actually ready to pounce on this matter
Yes.
because, the journey of, the law never ends because it's always developing and, the law is a vehicle of change. So the other thing as well with regards to that is Zimbabwe's technological capacities because that's also a thing, that will undoubtedly affect, the issue of business and human rights. Yeah, so what would be your take on that? We're not developing as quickly as we should technologically. So can we say that it's a matter of the law? Because like you were saying, our neighbor South Africa has done so many progressive things. And even in terms of like strictly legal matters, there's no e-filing system that's now on board. And, there are things like this that the government should be implementing that also just promote the use of technology and, the protection of human rights as well.
That's very interesting. I think the framework is there. The
Yes.
legal framework is there. I mean, there's frameworks for e-filing, like you've referred to.
Yes.
I mean, online business is,
Yes.
because of COVID, has
Yes.
been rapidly increased.
Yes.
So I think the call also is for businesses in the technological sector to perhaps have initiatives as a manner of contributing back to the society, that corporate social responsibility we were
Yes.
talking about.
Yes.
Either to have initiatives where they give data access to the
Yes.
underprivileged or
Yes.
cut costs on certain, perhaps
Yes.
it can be a decision of the board to come up with attractive means.
I'm sure the issue of data was well received by our listeners.
Yeah.
Because you know what, it might be surprising to hear this, but Zimbabwe, is a region that has some of the most high data charges, and I feel like that's also an issue that has to be lobbied against because data connectivity is undoubtedly a key issue with regards to the whole issue of technological development. Yeah.
That's true. And
Yes.
access to information being a human right, I think
Yes.
there's a lot of discussion
Yes,
that can
yes,
be
yes.
had in that regard.
Yes, that's brilliant, and thank you for bringing that up as well. Because access to information is a human right. The people need to know what's going on out there, and the people should listen to legal matters to know what's going on out there. So, Miss Moyo, thank you so much for coming to Legal Matters. It was really an interesting discussion with regards to this issue of business and human rights. And thank you for trying to package the law in a bite-sized manner so that people can understand, because we are passionate about making sure that all the listeners are legal-wise. What would you have to say, probably as a rundown, about the issue of business and human rights, and also probably how people can get in contact with organizations that you work with that lobby these issues of business and human rights, and also, yeah, shout outs, I guess.
No, thank you so much for having me today. I'm thoroughly passionate about this topic,
Yes.
and I think it's an ongoing discussion that
Yes,
we
yes.
all need to have.
Yes.
There's a call to business people to be more aware and to try and investigate how they can ensure that their organizations are aligned with human rights practices and contributing socially back to the community. And I think it's also for us individuals to just investigate how we can lobby and ensure that our human rights are enforced. Also call to legislature to ensure that the legislation itself mandates that companies are aligned to human rights. Yeah, so that's...
And to the directors as well, because like we're saying, the people who are going to be making business decisions are the people who are ultimately going to have the gun, either to shoot human rights or to save human rights.
Precisely. So it's, there's a call on directors to pay more attention to corporate governance, because that's the process in which they sit down and they decide the plans for the company and how their decisions will be made. And it is in that process that they can then fully investigate their impact on human rights of not only employees in the company, but the community at large.
And if they can pay the bill, they should just pay $20 for your book.
Exactly. There we go. Thank you. So the book is readily available. I think it's an important resource for directors who want to be compliant not only with human rights law, but with corporate law in general, and not be found on the side of violation.
Yes, because that would be bad for publicity, and you find that consumers may not actually maybe like to deal with that brand because it's associated with violating issues of business and human rights.
Exactly, and that affects the bottom line. So I would thoroughly encourage everyone to get a copy, and obviously if you have any questions, engage your lawyer and discuss those issues.
And also be sure to check out Miss Beatrice Moyo's blog, Lex Amicus, The Law Friend. So if you have any issues with regards to corporate governance, with regards to these issues of business and human rights, and how companies and entities can formate their plans and decisions around that, please be sure to get in contact. So that's all we have time for today on Legal Matters. Thank you once again, Ms. Moyo. It was a really interesting session, and keen to work on other initiatives that will be coming on board with the issue of business and human rights, as far as going to documentaries and making sure that there's just so much awareness about this issue of business and human rights, because each and every individual is a key player, because it's about human rights. So thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Tulani. I'm your host for Legal Matters. We're talking about the issue of business and human rights. So stay tuned to Heart and Soul, and catch me next week on Legal Matters as we talk about more topical aspects of the law that relate to your life on a daily basis. Thank you once again, Ms. Moyo.
Thank you so much, Tulani, for having me.